I'm going to do a short introduction to Kantian ethics. So we're going to look at two different principles that come out of Immanuel Kant's writing, the principle of universalizability and the principle of humanity. Kant thought that these principles ultimately were the same in the sense that they delivered the same answers to the question of whether an action is morally right or wrong. But we're going to treat them just as two different principles that might deliver different answers in different cases. So the principle of universalizability says this. It says that an action is morally permissible if and only if the maxim of your action could be universally embraced, such that everyone, if acting on that maxim, would be able to accomplish the goal of the action. So this is kind of a mouthful. It's a lot to wrap your head around. So we're going to unpack the meaning of the principle of universalizability, starting with this idea of a maxim. So what Kant means by a maxim is simply it's a description of your action and the rationale behind the action. So what is it that you're doing and why are you doing it? To give that is to give the maxim of your action. So for example, you could say that Albert robbed the bank in order to make himself wealthy, right? So the description of what Albert is doing is robbing a bank. The rationale for why he's robbing the bank is in order to make himself wealthy. So to think about applying the principle of universalizability, so kind of unpacking that original, that first bullet point there, you can think about it in kind of three steps. First, you formulate the maxim of your action. So let's just take the one above, the Albert robbed the bank in order to make himself wealthy. That's the maxim. That is what Albert's doing and why he's doing it. The second step is to imagine a world in which everyone acts on that same maxim. So we're supposed to imagine now a world in which not just Albert is robbing a bank, but in which everyone is robbing a bank, and they're doing it for the same reason, in order to make themselves wealthy, right? So finally, what we have to ask is, okay, in this world I'm imagining, in this case where everyone's robbing banks in order to make themselves wealthy, would I be able to achieve the goal of my action, right? What's stated in the rationale. Like, could it be the case that everyone becomes wealthy? Well, in this case, in thinking about, robbing a bank in order to make yourself wealthy, and imagine everyone doing that, a couple problems arise. First of all, money seems not to be infinite, right? So it seems like if everyone were trying to become wealthy by robbing banks, it wouldn't be possible, right? But even if we assume that money were somehow infinite, it still seems problematic for the simple reason that wealth seems to be something that's defined relatively, right? So like having more money than others. And if we define wealth in that way, as having more money than others, but we're imagining a world in which everybody is getting infinite amounts of money, it seems that wealth, what it means to be wealthy in that case, isn't possible anymore. Right? So however we look at it, whether we consider, money to be infinite or not, there seems to be a deep kind of logical problem with universalizing this maxim, right? The idea of robbing a bank in order to make yourself wealthy, right? There's something kind of deeply flawed as soon as you universalize that, because what ends up happening is that it looks like your action, the goal of your action, is no longer possible once you universalize that maxim. And that's the basic idea behind the principle of universalizability. That's what Kant's really trying to get at. So let's give some more examples, walk them through these the kind of three steps that I just laid out. So here's another maxim. Suppose that you're driving in the emergency lane, right? The lane of traffic that's reserved for emergency vehicles. So normal passenger vehicles, cannot drive in the emergency lane. It's against the law. But suppose that you do that. You break the law and drive in the emergency lane in order to escape a traffic jam, right? So there's a big traffic jam. You're sitting still on the freeway and you see the open emergency lane. You think to yourself, I'll just drive in that. Well, think about walking this through the principle of universalizability, right? Well, let's imagine a world in which not only you are doing that, but everybody is trying to escape the traffic jam by driving in the emergency lane. What's going to happen? Clearly, what's going to happen is that the emergency lane, just like all the other lanes of traffic now, is going to become clogged, and you're going to be in the same position, namely sitting in traffic. So finally, we ask ourselves, right, if everyone were acting on that same maxim, would you be able to achieve the goal of your action, which is in this case to escape the traffic jam? Well, in this case, of course not, right? If everyone were trying to do the same thing, then you would no longer be able to achieve what you're trying to achieve, right? Namely, getting out of traffic. So that means that this maxim would fail the test of universalizability, which means that doing this would be morally wrong, according to the principle of universalizability. Here's an example of a maxim that Immanuel Kant himself gives, and it's the idea of promising to repay money that you borrow with actually no intention of repaying it. And the reason you do this is you basically lie and say you'll repay the money even though you're not. And your goal, of course, is to get the money. And you think that by lying, you'll be able to get the money. So do the same thing. Walk it through those 3 steps. The second step, right, is, well, let's imagine that everyone is doing this. And what would a world be like in which everybody lied about repaying money? Well, if you kind of think of this world through time and you imagine like people making promises but nobody ever keeping those promises, well, do you think promises would be believed in such a world in which nobody kept promises? And the answer is no. No one would believe your promise. So the third step of that applying the principle of universalizability, right, was asking yourself, okay, so in such a world, this world that we're imagining, right, of course, which is a world in which nobody believes promises, would you be able to secure money by making a promise to repay it? And the answer is no, you wouldn't be able to secure that money in such a world, right? Because no one would believe your promise, right? And that's why making a false promise, or what Kant calls a lying promise, would be morally wrong. Let's imagine this one, though. Imagine that you rob a bank in order to redistribute the wealth equally to everyone. So yeah, imagine everyone doing this now, right? And everyone's goal this time is not to become wealthy, but to redistribute the money equally. It seems that there's no in principle reason why that couldn't be done, right? Whether money's finite or infinite, right? It looks like if your goal is to make a more equitable redistribution of money, then it seems like this would be possible even if everyone else were trying to do it. So this maxim, it seems, in contrast to the other bank robbing maxim, this one would pass the principle of universalizability, and so therefore it would be morally permissible for the Kantian. One of the things about universalizability, if you think about it, is that it rules out what economists call free riding. Free riding is just the idea of not following a rule and kind of getting away with something, but simply the only way you're able to get away with it is because everybody else is following the rule. So take our traffic jam example, right? If the only way that's going to work for you to break the law is if everybody else is following the law. If everyone else breaks the law, then it doesn't work for you. You can't be a free rider, right? In this case, your free riding is relying on the fact that everybody else is following the rule and only you are not following the rule, right? Another example would be think about paying tax money each year, right? Paying your taxes. So suppose that instead of paying my taxes, I use the money for a vacation, right? Now, if everyone were doing that same thing, the government obviously is going to catch on, and moreover, there's going to be a huge problem with the government not collecting any tax money at all, which is going to lead to catastrophic problems, right? If no one pays their taxes. But if everyone does pay their taxes and only you don't pay your taxes, then it seems like in that case, right, that's a clear case of you being a free rider. The only way that it works for you to be able to kind of continue to to not pay your taxes but continue to drive on roads and use the police and all these other services that are funded through tax dollars, right? The only reason that works for you is because everybody else is paying their tax dollars. So one kind of argument in favor of the principle of universalizability is that it makes free riding morally impermissible. One of the things that is in common with all of those examples in the textbook and the ones that I've used here, one of the things that the maxims that fail the test of universalizability, the thing that they have in common is that they're all cases of free riding. So it's interesting that this principle of universalizability kind of rules out all cases of free riding. And there's something to be said in favor of that, because we have a kind of deep aversion to people getting away with things when everyone else is following the rule. It violates our sense of fairness, right? And because the principle of universalizability rules out all cases of free riding as morally impermissible, this kind of accords with our sense of what is fair. The other principle that we'll discuss, the Kantian principle, is the principle of humanity. And that says this: always treat people, including ourselves, as ends in themselves rather than as mere means. So what does it mean to treat someone as a mere means? What he means by this is thinking only about your own desires and goals, right? So, if I wanted to kind of, if my car's broken and I need it fixed and I take it to the auto mechanic, and the auto mechanic fixes the car, but then I just drive off without paying the bill, right? That would be treating the auto mechanic as a mere means. Like, I'm not thinking about, what their purposes and goals are, which of course is in part to make a living. I'm only thinking about my own, goals, which is getting my car fixed. And I disregard or don't care the goals of the mechanic. And that would be treating the mechanic as a mere means. In contrast, to treat the mechanic as an end in themselves, to treat a person as an end in themselves, is to consider that person's own desires and goals. So, like, if after the mechanic fixes the car, I pay them, the rate that they have asked, the bill that they have given me, then that is to respect their goals, right? Their goal, of course, is to make a living, right, by fixing my car. So if I pay them, then I am respecting their own goals. Whereas if I drive off without paying them, then I'm not. I'm treating them as a mere means versus as an end in themselves. As an example of this that I use in the textbook, imagine that my father smokes cigarettes and I know how unhealthy this is and I can see the problems that it's causing for his health. And in order to try to get him to stop smoking cigarettes, I lie to him. I make up a story about where the cigarettes come from, the company that he buys cigarettes from, that they actually employ child labor and treat the children really harshly, and it's really bad. And so I tell him this and I make him believe it, right? I know that it's false, but I lie to him, right? Because I think that if he believes that these cigarettes are coming from this really horrible source, that he'll not smoke cigarettes anymore. And that's my goal, right? My goal is to get my father to stop smoking cigarettes, right? And in order to do that, I lie to him. I make up a story. That would be violating the principle of humanity in a very clear sense, right? Because I am only thinking about my own goal, which, again, might be a good goal, like because I care about my father's health. But again, that's my goal, right? And I'm disregarding what my father's, goals and values and purposes might be, right? So in lying to my dad, I'm essentially manipulating him. I'm kind of inserting a false belief into his reasoning process in the hopes that he'll no longer smoke cigarettes, right? And that's a kind of straightforward manipulation. I'm treating him in the same way by lying to him, making up this story about where cigarettes come from. I'm essentially manipulating him like a kind of puppet, right? In this kind of subtle way in which I'm inserting this kind of false belief into his reasoning process that makes him end up ultimately not smoking cigarettes anymore. That's my goal for him, but that might not be, what he wants, right? If he had a true belief, and I didn't lie to him, then maybe he wouldn't stop smoking, right? Maybe he doesn't care about his health in the same way. So lying and manipulation of any sort is always going to be ruled out by the principle of humanity as morally impermissible, right? That's because lying to a person is treating them as a mere means. Why? Well, because you're bypassing their own reasoning process, which involves their own beliefs, their own desires, their own values, right? And I'm knowingly inserting a false belief into that process in the hopes of getting them to act differently, right? That's what lying's doing. And so in that way, lying really is just a kind of manipulation. And if you want a kind of picture of what the Kantian finds really morally problematic, it's treating a person who has their own reasons for doing things, right? Who has their own goals in life. It's treating them as a kind of puppet and trying to get them to behave in the way that we want them to, right? Instead of the way that they would like to behave, right? So lying is just a kind of a manipulation. And any manipulation is wrong, comes out as morally impermissible, according to the principle of humanity. So it's really important to contrast the principle of humanity with, for example, the principle of utility that the utilitarian holds up. The principle of humanity sees certain types of actions as morally wrong, right? Whereas the utilitarian is going to take this as a case-by-case basis, right? So for the utilitarian, sometimes lying could be the morally right thing to do, again, because it brings about a greater good. And sometimes lying can be the morally wrong thing to do because it, decreases net well-being, right? Whereas for the principle of humanity, lying is always going to be wrong, and it doesn't depend on the outcome, right? So there are a number of kind of types of actions that come out as always wrong for the principle of humanity. Any kind of manipulation, clearly something like rape, and clearly something like slavery, those are types of actions that are categorically morally wrong. That is, they are always morally wrong. It doesn't matter what the consequences of those actions are for the Kantian, because they all involve treating a rational human being who has their own goals and purposes as something to be manipulated for our own purposes. And that is the core of what's behind the principle of humanity, that idea of manipulating someone for our own purposes. The Kantian's going to say, human beings, are not there just to be manipulated for your own purposes. They have their own goals and purposes, and those should be respected. Even if you think that your own goals and purposes are good, it doesn't matter. You can't manipulate someone else just for your own purposes, whatever those are. So let's finish by considering some of the problematic cases that we raised for the principle of utility. One of them was the unwilling organ donor, right? So imagine 5 people who need organs, and this one totally healthy person that comes into the doctor, and they happen to be a match, unbeknownst to them, for these 5 people who need organ donations, and the doctor thinks, well, I can just kill this one healthy person, donate the 5 organs to these people in need of organs, and thus save 5 lives. Right? So the utilitarian, again, this is a huge problem because killing a person in this way seems a huge violation of that person's rights, of their fundamental right to life. Even if killing them brings about a greater good, it feels like there's something really deeply wrong in this case, right? And notice how the principle of humanity, acknowledges and shows what's wrong with that, right? Why? Well, even if we admit that, yes, killing this person would bring about, increase in net well-being, right? We save 5 lives, and think about those, not only those 5 lives, but the families of those people that are affected, right, etc. Clearly, just like the trolley scenario, it seems like taking the one life is going to increase net well-being. But the principle of humanity says, yeah, that's all true, but that doesn't matter. Because what matters morally is not that we increase net well-being, but that we respect individuals' rights. We treat them as an end in themselves. We don't use them as a means to achieving something else. Even if that something else is a greater good, to use a person, right, as a mere means to accomplish a greater good is morally wrong, according to the Kantian, according to the principle of humanity. Finally, consider the peeping Tom example, the person who goes around spying on people in their kind of intimate moments, and they're totally undetected, so no one ever knows they're there. Again, according to the principle of utility, it seems like, hey, this person, the peeping Tom's, well-being is increasing because they're enjoying what they're doing, and since nobody knows what they're doing, it seems no one else's well-being is decreasing. So it seems like, hey, there's a net increase to, net well-being. And yet, this feels like there's something deeply wrong. It feels like the peeping Tom is violating something deep and important in spying on these people. And indeed, the principle of humanity explains why this is so, right? Those people are being used, right, in a way kind of lied to or manipulated because they don't know that they're being watched by the peeping Tom, right? If they did, of course, they would take actions to stop it. But it seems like the peeping Tom is using those people that he's spying on as a mere means to his own end of whatever, pleasure, right? So again, here are two really problematic cases for the principle of utility, but you see how the principle of humanity easily handles them.